And we're going to move to the 11 o'clock portion of the agenda with Bonnie Devine, her art exhibit and interpret of Treaty 22 and 23. All right, so I'd like to welcome Bonnie Devine to the stage.
So can you show the first slide? No, the one before. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Bonnie Devine Nadishnikas, Ganabaching Nadunjba, Makwa Dodem. I come from Serpent River First Nation, Ganabaching, on the north shore of Lake Huron, Anishinaabe. My family moved to Toronto permanently when I was 11 years old, and I was educated there in high school from that age on. So my memories of living on the res are when I was a young kid. I had many questions at that time. It was in the 50s and 60s, and we were still grappling to try to find out our history. And in fact, actually, I should amend that, because I think that at that time we were striving really hard to forget our history. It was hard to talk about things that had happened in the past. There wasn't a lot of information. People were reticent to speak about the old days when I was growing up. I imagine that all of us in this room who are of that certain age had that experience where we were striving very hard to forget. And what I'm so happy about is to see a gathering like this, where we are striving to remember, and we're striving to gather back the information that was buried and hidden from us, and striving to reclaim our place in this continent, our stories and histories of our places, and our deep, deep connection to those places and those names. I feel very honored to be asked to present here, so I'd like to thank Vicky and Margaret for inviting me specifically, and Kathy too. I'm not a member of your First Nation, but I am related to you because of my Anishinaabe heritage. Sometimes in doing the research that I undertook in order to create the work for this exhibition, I came to a very interesting question, which is, I wonder if I'm actually a Mississauga. I come from a little place on the north shore of Lake Huron, near Cutler, Ontario. Cutler is sort of our capital city. Some of you may know. I see someone nodding. You know Cutler. We're on the Trans-Canada Highway, halfway between Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie. Down the road from us, our next neighbor over, just west of us, is in Blind River. It's a place called Mississauga. And when we moved here, when I was 11 years old, I realized there's a Mississauga here, just west of Toronto. And I always wondered, what's the connection between these two places? How is it that those Mississauga people are up there in the central part of Ontario, quite far away, 7-hour drive still to get there. Back in the old days, it would have been a long paddle to get down here, or a long trek overland. And Alan Corbier, who was speaking just before me, and who unfortunately we didn't get to hear all of his talk, but I hope that we do. He's done deep, deep research, looking at maps, looking at the treaty belts, understanding and talking to elders, and trying to really reconstruct the movements of our people, the history and trajectories of our explorations of our territory. I always thought, it was my intuition, that those Mississauga people had traveled south here because of war, because of some of the incredible conflict that Alan was describing in the bit of his talk that we were able to hear, which was those wars with the Haudenosaunee people, and how there were, pushes north when the Haudenosaunee were attacking us, and then pushes south when our people were retaliating and moving south. And I got the idea that the Mississauga people had been nomadic, that they lived up there at one point and then down here at another, and that this is where they were for good. But as my knowledge deepened, and as more and more knowledge is available, and it is, because we are now trying to remember, I came across Doug Williams' book about Mississauga. This is our territory. And in that book, and I really highly recommend it because I believe that Doug cracks open some of this history and really talks about the extent of Mississauga territory in Ontario, and it is astounding. It is an epic story of survival and resourcefulness and courage, because it was not easy. About 3 years ago, I was invited by the city of Mississauga, which is a non-native territory, of course, to do some research about Mississauga. I'm an artist and a professor at OCAD University. I bring kind of an interesting history to my scholarship. I'm not like Alan. I'm not a historian in a formal sense. But I am, like him, feeling my way around this territory of our story and our history. So I took it on. When they asked me if I would do that research for the city of Mississauga, I took it on. And at the time, I thought that what I would do would be to go to the various museums in Mississauga and do what I called a cultural audit. What I was interested in is, how do we learn this history that we are so hungry now to learn? Where can we go to find sources to follow that thread and try to reconstruct our memory, our collective memory? And so I went around. I went to Peel Museum. I went to the Historical Museum in Mississauga. They gave me access to all of their institutions so that I could go and see what books were there, what knowledge, what maps, what kind of repository did they have of art history. And what I found was that in every single one of those institutions, history started with the Mississauga, with the Toronto Purchase. History started with John Graves Simcoe and the arrival of the English here in this part of the world. And it was pretty obvious that in those institutions, they had no investment in our history. They had no interest. And when I would ask them, well, what I'm really interested in is the Mississauga people. All of them would say, well, go to New Credit and talk to them. And they would divert it that way. And it was, and this is a critique, like I was angered when I found this, because I thought, this is how colonialism works. You will ask a question of the librarian, and the librarian will send you away to some place where the information is really difficult, even more difficult than it is in the library or in the museum to find. Go to the First Nations, they said. It's like, well, I'm a Anishinaabe, Kwe, and even for me, this is not easy instructions. But for someone else who doesn't have that connection, how could they ever find out? This is why I'm so happy to see the materials that your community has produced, the maps, the texts, the descriptions, the narrative that is gradually emerging that represents a huge amount of intellectual and cultural labor. And I think that this has gone largely unrecognized and unacknowledged, and certainly not represented in the museums. But this is the next step, is to move this knowledge out to the larger community. And as I was thinking about this when I was doing this research, I decided that the best thing for me to do was not to talk about those museums, this absence of knowledge, this absence of information, but to talk about my own understanding of how this place came to be and how our people came to be here, and what the connection was to my own practice. So I made an exhibition that opened last September at the Art Gallery of Mississauga. It was called Circles and Lines, Michi Zagig. And of course, Alan has talked about this name, Michi Zagig. What does that mean? And in Alan's knowledge, and of course he's so much more knowledgeable about the language and about the history, about the belts and the treaties than I am. And yet I recognized right away what he said. It means that big place, che, that big place, humongous. And saging, it means where the river opens out to the lake, the mouth of the river. And when I heard that, I could understand right away, the connection to Mississauga up in Blind River, near where I grew up, because it's right on that beautiful river that runs into Lake Huron. And here, of course, there are many, many rivers that run into Lake Ontario. It is one of the characteristics, one of the defining characteristics, actually, of this particular part of the world, is the way that everything drains into those beautiful lakes. And it's particularly appropriate that this happens today when we've lost our water walker, that everything goes back to refer again to those rivers and those beautiful lakes. So yeah, I'll change. So the work that I started on this project began with this scroll that I made back in 2015. It was called A Scroll for the Mississauga. And I wanted to make this as an initial offering to your community, actually, to talk about the transaction that occurred here called the Toronto Purchase, and the way that such a huge and valuable piece of property was exchanged. So I began to write out the words of the treaty. I wrote them out and this is so interesting. The words of this treaty are easily available. They are online, and you can even download an image of the treaty, a facsimile of the original document from the Province of Ontario archival website. So I simply copied out the words of that treaty. And somehow for me, and I don't know how many of you feel this way too, but somehow that act of actually writing out the words brings home a whole new meaning. It's different from reading those words if you're writing those words. And so carefully lettering all of the words of that treaty brought home to me the epic story, the epic betrayal that occurred here. And this was sort of the start of my journey, was to talk about how that came to be and what the implications were. So I'm going to move around because I always like to go and, show. This is the bottom of the land tract that was transferred. Of course, this is Toronto Island, and this is the Etobicoke Creek. This is Ashford Bay. This is quite a long distance between these two, and it stretches quite a high way up. It stretches north of Major Mackenzie Road, if you know. Oh, okay. Yeah. Is that better?
Turn it on. There's a button there.
Okay. Is that better? Yeah. So this was the beginning of my my journey, was to show that that map, the lakeshore, hugely important to the Mississauga people. They regarded the lake as their mother. Or this is me talking kind of as a dreamer, as an artist, so please excuse me. And I'm so glad Alan's not here, because he's very precise in his thinking, and I'm much more imprecise. So bear with me, you know, I'm an artist here. But anyway, yeah, so very interested in the actual land that was exchanged. The paint that I used was rabbit skin glue. It's a distemper paint. So this is my way of trying to approximate the petrographs that Alan was talking about. Every time there would be a battle, those Anishinaabe people would record the details of that battle in a painting, in a picture on the rocks. And I believe, and there's some science to this, why they've lasted so long is because they're made out of fish glue. That was the medium that they used to make that paint. Specifically sturgeon. And I couldn't get a hold of any sturgeon glue, but I got a hold of some rabbit glue. This is an old European way of making paint from ancient times. And that's what I used to make this map, in order to try to connect myself back to that old way of claiming. In many ways, what I was trying to do actually was spiritually and intuitively reconnect to this territory. The next one. So in the middle of the scroll, you see the text continues along. You have to walk. This piece is about 17 feet long. So to read it, you have to walk all the way down to the end of the scroll and then walk all the way back and start again and read it again. So it is, in many ways, for me, what I was trying to do was get the viewer to walk, to experience this notion of distance, of space, of how we are in this world. We're not just observers. We're active. Underneath the writing, there's a graphite picture of a tree on its side. And the reason that I wanted to make a picture of that tree was because in the old accounts from the surveyors who initially mapped out the Toronto Purchase, they blazed an old maple tree that stands right in the corner, in the northwest corner of the Purchase. There was this old, magnificent maple tree there. It doesn't stand any longer, but it runs straight as a die from the place on the western part of Lake Ontario where the Purchase began, straight north of Major Mackenzie Road. And they blazed that trail, and they blazed that tree, and that marked the northwestern extent of the Toronto Purchase. So I did a drawing of that out of pencil and put that underneath the writing. And I don't know if you can read this. You don't need me to read this to you, eh? Yeah. Okay. It's made of paper. It's watercolor paper. It rolls up. I made it in several pieces, so there's 5 pieces to it, and they're sewn together. And what I was trying to do with that was reference the old birch bark scrolls. When I said earlier that when I was growing up, when I was a little kid, we wouldn't talk about history, and we wouldn't talk about the old days, and it was almost as if they hadn't existed, and all that was left was our deep determination to survive, to get jobs, to feed our families, and to somehow maintain some kind of a family life. And this is when the families became so important. But when I got to university, I found out that we did have a written record. We did have a history. And for the Anishinaabe people, these histories were recorded either on those belts that Alan talks about, or they were recorded in birch bark scrolls that were secreted away when the government outlawed them. The government made it a crime to make those scrolls or to keep those scrolls. And the government confiscated many, many of those scrolls. And a lot of them are now in the museum. I saw examples of those birch bark scrolls at the Royal Ontario Museum. And when I saw them, I wept, as I'm sure many of us in this room would weep to see this, because we had been told that we had no history, that we had no means of recording our elder stories or our old origins. And this was a lie. And it was told for bad reasons. They did not have they were not thinking of our welfare when they outlawed our talking about these things. They were trying to rub us out, as my grandpa used to say. So what I wanted to do with this scroll was to make something that would remind me and potentially the viewer that there was a record. Next. I was interested, this is still part of this, this long scroll. I was interested in the islands. I was interested in the lakes. Because, of course, the English, when they made this treaty, they were interested in the land. They wanted to get a hold of that particular place that had a wonderful harbor. It was fed by three major rivers, the Don, the Rouge, and the Humber. They saw it as a tremendously important strategic military site, but also a site of commerce and trade. So they wanted to establish their industries there. They were interested in all of this. But what I was interested in, and what I think our people were interested in, wasn't so capitalistic, can I say that? It was really about the way that the water and the land interact with one another, the way that they are in relation to one another, and the way that they talk to one another, and the way that they sustain us. And this is actually what that word Mississauga means, that place where the river joins the lake. And this is just, next one. This is just continuing that story of the maple tree and talking about the language, the legalese of the treaty that the English used to describe how this was laid out. What they were really interested in, this indenture, was to quantify exactly what the tract of land was, because there had been an earlier treaty that was signed in, I think, 1796 or something. Someone here will be able to be more precise about that date, but several decades earlier, there was an original Toronto Purchase, but it wasn't signed. They still have it at City Hall. It wasn't signed, and it didn't specify what the territory was that was being exchanged. It was kind of an act of stupidity in many ways on the part of the colonizers to do it that way. So they realized this a few decades later, and they came back and they made an indenture to the Toronto Purchase, and this is what I have copied out. And in this indenture, really the prime directive for them was to precisely lay out what were the boundaries of the purchase, what was actually being exchanged. They also talked about how much money would be exchanged, and it was a paltry sum, 10 shillings, for a huge amount of land in the center of Ontario that has now become, of course, the largest city in our country. So this is, I think this is most of the scroll. It's quite long, as you see, and I couldn't really get the whole thing in. Here's the actual purchase, the actual map of that. Here's my imaginary depiction of the council where this treaty was formulated. So here are the 5 colonial signatories, and here are the Mississauga chiefs who signed it. And here are their glyphs. They didn't sign with letters, they signed with their totems. And you can find this, some of you probably have already found it many times, but this is the last page of that original document from 1805. And of course, these are the 5 British officials who were there, who signed it. And these are the Mississauga ancestors, the grandfathers, who also agreed to this purchase. We could talk a long time about the ramifications of that purchase, whether it was actually a purchase, whether the Mississauga understood that it was a purchase, or whether they understood it to be a peace and friendship agreement. Many of our treaties have been interpreted by colonial historians as basically giving title to the land to someone else, selling it. But as we talk more and more to elders, and as we look more and more into those belts that Alan shows, the idea was not so much about selling as it was about sharing. Many of the treaties that were made with the Crown were of that nature. They were peace and friendship agreements that were saying, yes, we have land and it is plentiful, and if you need a place to stay, yes, you can stay here, and we will share this with you in peace and harmony. And I believe, actually, that this was the nature of the understanding here between the Mississauga and the British, was that the treaty, the sale of their land, would not leave them homeless. Of course, what happened was this treaty, this indenture, left the Mississauga people of southern Ontario virtually homeless. So my first act, when I was thinking about this exhibition that I wanted to do about this particular piece of history, was I made a diptych. It means that there's 2 panels. On the right is a map of the shoreline of Lake Ontario, the Mimico Creek, the Credit River, and all of the roads that were laid out. They're in a really strong grid pattern, and they're in a really strong grid pattern even though the shoreline is nothing like a grid. But the British had this obsession with making everything really straight as an arrow. We can see it on our highways. You know, they would prefer to cut through a mountain to make that road straight than to go around and honor the contour of the geography. So I thought that was very interesting. But mostly I wanted to show the grandfathers who signed that treaty I wanted to show them here because, of course, they are still here, even though their story is not often told or has been told in a way that doesn't really do justice to that history. On the right side of the panel is an imaginary drawing that I wanted to make that had a different relationship to the land, not about making a grid pattern, not about creating roads and commerce and cities and apartment buildings, but something that is much more deeply felt. So this is my rendition of the petroglyph site near Curve Lake. And this is, of course, the Milky Way. And I wanted to talk in this way about a much, much more enduring relationship to the land and to place and to who we are as a people, as human beings. And our relationship, again, this relationship I see as dishonored, but this relationship I see as honored. And I wanted to talk about that contrast, the different ways that we look at land and the different ways that we look at ownership of land. And for me, this was my way of saying that. The Anishinaabe have a different worldview. So the way that I thought I could best articulate this difference was through the use of technology. And this is an antique surveyor's transit. I got it on Kijiji. I traveled far. Yeah, I was looking for it because I really knew that I couldn't express the violence of this if I didn't have the actual object. So I searched for that, and I found one up in Barrie, and I drove up there and bought it from an antique store in Barrie, and I brought it back. And what I wanted to show was that this act of surveying, of drawing lines, of setting out plots of land, or of subdividing districts, you know, we're on the first line here, I think, that was laid out by a surveyor. And those surveyors were Europeans. And they understood that as soon as they laid that line out, whether it was actually on the land by blazing the tree and, you know, drawing string across, or whether they did it on a map with a pencil and just drew a line on the map, they understood that doing that gave them title. It gave them a way of claiming. And it wasn't too long before those Anishinaabe figured that out too. They figured out that as soon as these guys come, and if you see this, this transit, surveyor's transit, it's bad news, real bad news. There are stories all across North America of battles with surveyors. Battle Creek, Michigan, I was talking about this on the way up here. Battle Creek, Michigan is named because the Potawatomi people had a battle with a couple of surveyors who were trying to lay out land in Michigan. They beat the surveyors momentarily and they left, but a few years later they were back. And the Potawatomi, of course, were pushed further west. So I wanted to talk about this, weaponized technology, weaponized knowledge, the way that instruments like this, it's not a gun, but look at how it points, eh? The tripod is old but still firm. It has big piton on the bottom. You can drive it into the ground. It's solid. The thing is heavy. The instrument at the top is heavy. These were tools of colonialism that our people recognized quite early on. And I wanted to make that in the hallway right across from the scroll that describes the transfer of land back in 1805. I came to understand that what I was interested in was defining the difference between that approach to land ownership and an indigenous approach to land ownership. And so I made this at the far end of that surveyor's line. And this is made out of cardboard. There's an armature underneath. It's quite big. It's about, I would say, maybe 16 or 20 feet in diameter. So it's quite a large circle in the middle of the gallery. And the armature, the base of the sculpture is cardboard, so it's easy to manipulate. Single-sided cardboard. It's a perfect sculptural tool. But on top of that cardboard armature are reeds. And this was really important to me. The reeds had to come from Mississauga First Nation. They had to have some relationship back to the territory, to the land. So I asked permission of Vicky to come and gather those reeds, and we came, 3 of us came in September, and I have a minivan, and we cut a whole bunch of reeds. Down on First Line by the old cemetery, we found a beautiful glade, and those reeds, they were green and marvelously beckoning. They were welcoming me. We put down our tobacco and we went down there and we picked all day. And for me, this is crucial. This way of honoring the bounty of the earth, but also recognizing that those plants are older than me. Those plants are wiser. Those are our elders. And for me to go and gather them and then bring them right to the center of Mississauga City. And you know, this gallery is right in City Hall at Mississauga. The council chambers for the mayor and all of those officials in Mississauga City were upstairs. And I found it so moving to be bringing something from here, right there, as an act of defiance, as an act of claiming, because I wanted to make some kind of mark. You know, those English, and I'm sorry if I'm being a bit racist here when I say those English, but I have to say it. But those English, they'll make a cross, eh? When they mark, X marks the spot, you know, they are really into this linear kind of marking. And I knew that I didn't want to make that. I wanted to make a circle. I wanted to refer, actually, to the Dish with One Spoon treaty between the First Nations of this region and across Montreal as well. I wanted to talk about this idea that we don't own that land. We signed that paper, those Mississauga chiefs signed that paper. Doesn't mean they said they were owning that land and now transferring that ownership to someone else. They were talking about sharing. They were talking about living together in some kind of harmony. And for me, that circle represented that. That was what I was interested in talking about. We called it a circle of inquiry because I was interested in maybe having discussions about these matters, about the issue of ownership, the issue of land transfer, and we actually did that. The Art Gallery of Mississauga facilitated a couple of artist talks, and we sat, all the people who came sat around that big circle, and we talked. We talked for hours. We had marvelous discussions, and Vicki and Kathy came, and Margaret Sue came, and you know, it's interesting. The people in Mississauga who are non-native, they're almost as interested in this story as we are now. There is a huge hunger, it seems, within the non-native community to find out more about the actual history. It doesn't in any way supersede our own hunger and our own need to find this out. And I think one of the interesting and probably troubling dilemmas that faces us as we move forward and as we uncover more and more of our history is how much of it are we to share? How much of it do we hold close because it's ours? Hey, we need to teach our kids and we need to understand it in our own bodies so that we can get strong. And I'm not sure that, sending it out into the world so quickly is maybe not quite the thing to do. I'm not sure. This is something that we wanted to talk about in this circle. And we had lots of really, really good discussions. So those were the two kind of sculptural pieces in the exhibition, the Surveyor's Transit and the Circle of Inquiry. But all around the gallery were a number of paintings that I made in order to try to illustrate this idea about the difference between a linear worldview and a circular worldview. And so I went on the website of the University of Toronto. They've got a marvelous collection there of antique maps. And they're all free. You can download them, and they're really high res. And it's public domain. So there's no fee attached. There's no copyright attached. These are here for our knowledge. And I found that this was a very, very useful research tool for someone like me who is interested in visual representations and also interested in the concept behind it. So this was the first map that I downloaded, and it's the located districts of the province of Upper Canada. It was made in 1813, and you can see that they are dividing that land into plots. It's as if some of them are absolutely dead straight. And you can imagine those surveyors going out on the land. And at this time, it would have been full of trees, right? No roads, not very many pathways, certainly no concessions where you would have farms. But this is what they were doing. They were deciding where the farms would be, where the county lines would be, and numbering them. And this is the process, right? This is what happens. What I was interested in, of course, was the rivers, because this map doesn't take account of the rivers. It doesn't take account of those vast and important highways that our people used in order to get around in this territory. I put in a canoe because I was very interested in the way that the canoe was actually the thing that opened up the land for us. It wasn't the surveyor's, dead straight transit. It was this. And this is flexible, easy to carry. It's light. You can make it on your own if you're clever. I've made one. It's disposable, but it doesn't harm when you dispose of it. I mean, it's a beautifully refined, perfected design. And I just thought, wow, here's what we did, and here's what they did. And let's just look at that and think about that. And so I did. This is the oldest map that I downloaded and printed. What I did was I downloaded them as TIFF files. Some of you who are into photography may know about that. They're very large, high-resolution files. I took them to a printer in Toronto and had them printed out on archival paper. And then I painted on panels beside them. So this is an old map by Guillaume de Lille, who was sent here by the French king back in 1675. It's actually a detail of a much larger map. This map is enormous. It is of all of the French territories in North America at that time. And at that time, the French had Quebec. They had Louisiana, New Orleans, much of the territory around Chicago, Illinois, was French territory, and everything kind of west of the Mississippi was either French or Spanish. And the French were very, very interested in mapping this. And as I mentioned, mapping was a way for the Europeans to actually claim the territory for their king. So they sent out Guillaume de Lisle, and he mapped the Mississippi River, he mapped the Gulf of Mexico, he mapped the Texan shoreline on the Gulf of Mexico and Florida, and then he mapped the Great Lakes and Mississippi. It's one of the oldest depictions of North America that we have, actually. And what I did was I carved out, cropped it, so that it would show this area. So here's Lac Erie, or Lac du Chat, Lake of the Cat. Why they called it that, I don't know. Here's Lac Ontario. Here's Lake Simcoe. They were beginning, this is interesting to me, these maps, because it shows a slightly different perspective between the English and the French. The French, you can see, are really interested in the water. They show those rivers. All of the rivers are really carefully drawn. They're showing here this eventual portage that will go from Toronto to Lake Simcoe and to Georgian Bay. They were interested in the fur trade, of course, and they were our allies, so they were close allies of the Anishinaabe, and were very, very interested in creating a kind of mind map of how we would get around and how they could monetize this, of course, how the trade routes would help them. They also mapped, and this was really interesting to me, they mapped the different territories of the people. So down here, this is Upper New York State. These are the Finger Islands, or the Finger Lakes, and here it says Iroquois. The French named those Iroquois people, of course. And up here, Algonquia. And over here, somewhere in here, it's hard to read here, but it's Mississauga. 1675. I just thought, wow. Here's this really important repository of knowledge that tells us so much. And if you can imagine, and some of you may want to go on the U of T website and have a look at this map, because you can see the whole thing. He did a remarkable job of cataloging this early history of this region. What I wanted to do was show a different way of looking at this territory, and this is my rendition of the North Shore of Lake Ontario and those rivers that feed into the Great Lake, what Mississauga is named after. And of course, the Mississauga were fisher people. They were not, they weren't farmers. So for them, it was really, really crucial that they were able to settle at the mouths of the river. Fishing's good there, and lots of varieties of fish from the lake, and river fish as well. So very, very fertile ground here. This is where the Mississauga were interested in living. And this is what they valued, actually, was those places where the river feeds into the lake. And that's what I wanted to show. There are some similarities, but not really. So you can see where I'm going with this. What I was really interested in was digging out some old maps, looking at them, and then creating something of my own that would respond to it in a kind of contrary way. So This was the Public Roads and Highways map, 1914, about 300 years after that first map that I showed. But it's of the same territory. There's the Finger Lakes. There's our beloved Great Lakes. And they were beginning to think about roads. They knew that as the population grew, they needed to create access to places. And so they were beginning to set out those major roads. And of course, I mentioned earlier that portage, sorry, am I doing this okay with this thing? Can you, okay. There was a major portage here from Toronto to Lake Simcoe. They called it a carrying place. Why? Because that's where they would carry the canoes, right? They get out of the canoe, put it on their backs, and walk north. It was an old logging road as well later on. And Simcoe saw the native people using that road. And he thought, very, very clever guy, he thought, wow, this must be useful. If those Indians are using it so regularly, must be useful. And explored it further and discovered that this is a route to the upper Great Lakes. And it saves a huge amount of traveling time if you don't have to go down the Niagara River, portage around the falls, cross Lake Erie, go north on the Detroit River through Lake St. Clair, and then up the St. Clair River to the foot of Lake Huron. This is a journey of several weeks. If you could get out of your canoe at Toronto and carry it overland to Lake Simcoe, get back into the water, go across Lake Simcoe, and it's a short series of hops through other lakes there, right into Georgian Bay. And John Graves Simcoe saw that and he thought, I can use this. He originally built a corduroy road. That's where they put the trunks of trees across the pathway. And you can kind of very bumpy ride, but it would keep it kind of dry in flood season. So they put initially a corduroy road, and then they later paved that road over with gravel and eventually with asphalt. And it became Highway 11, which is, of course, Yonge Street. And this continues to be one of the major technological innovations that the English brought here, but it's not a technological innovation at all. This was our old way to get up to Lake Simcoe. And Lake Simcoe actually was originally called Tarantan, Toronto. And on some old French maps, you'll see it labeled that way, Tarantan. And what that means is the place where the trees stand in the water. And why does that matter? Some of you might know. There's a fishing weir here, a very old traditional place where the people would go to trap the fish as they were coming out of Lake Couchiching. And that still stands. And that's what that's what the people were interested in, those Mississaugas, going up there and getting those fish. And they maintained those weirs for centuries. You can still see them. Actually, there's some really wonderful pictures of those on the internet, taken quite recently. But those old posts are still standing there in the water. And so my response to this map was to make a survey of the Great Lakes. These are the Great Lakes, but it's according to their depths. So this is Lake Superior. This is Lake Huron. I also found this on the internet and sort of transposed it to my own way of thinking about it. This is Lake Erie. And this is Niagara Falls. And then this is Lake Ontario, and then Lake Ontario leads out to the St. Lawrence River. And I thought it was really interesting that, the English were able to make these depictions. They sounded the lakes, and they drew maps to show how deep the water was. They were interested, of course, in the commercial value of the lakes. They wanted to know, are they navigable by ocean-going vessels? How far can we go? And what I thought was, what a beautiful geological formation this is. What a wonder that we live in a place where the lakes have found their grounding. They found their bottoms, and that the animals are able to survive in there because of those lakes. Those lakes are our sustenance. They are our life. This is an old survey map of the Toronto Harbour. This is the islands that are just south of the city of Toronto. And this kind of came into my research because in the original Toronto Purchase, the islands aren't mentioned. And there is some dispute about who those islands actually belong to now. And were they part of the original purchase or not? So this is my depiction of the islands and the circle above them, just to indicate our belonging to the land. We don't own that land owns us. And this was my way of saying, sacred islands. Here we see the colonial map, 1820-ish, and what they did was they put down chains, and they measured. These are all chain lengths. They went out in little boats, and they measured how deep those lakes were, or the harbor was, so that they would know if the boats could come in. So it was one of the investigations that they made, one of the decisions that played into whether or not they needed this land or not. And of course, once they discovered how deep that is and what a marvelous natural harbor it is, it secured for them forever their hold on the city of Toronto. This map was made in 1867. And this is a strategic map, really. They were considering at this time that there might be trouble. And they were looking at how defensible is the city of Toronto. So they were mapping, it's a topographical map, and it also shows some of the major defensive, natural defensive characteristics of the land. So they were thinking, here's Toronto over here. They're thinking, okay, if we get attacked by the United States, what can we depend on the land to help us with? And so that's what that is. It's basically a reconnaissance map. Well, so I was interested in this notion of impenetrability or defense or keeping people out. And I thought about this. So these are maple trees. And their canopy, the part that you can see of the tree, of course, is a natural barrier, natural defense. But underneath, the roots that go down and that intermingle with one another beneath the soil, this is an even deeper defense. These are the roots. These are our roots. This is our natural barrier to that oncoming invasion from the West. How am I doing for time? And this is the old map of the Toronto Purchase, 1805. So it's mapping out. And you can see there's no islands there. I think this is interesting. No islands mentioned in this. But this is a sketch of the tract purchased from the Mississauga Indians. And I recreated this in this way, but tried to show a different way of looking at the division of land. In the original understanding, I think, of this treaty, what the Mississauga people said was, well, you can have everything north of the shore, but we must keep the shore. And why? It's because of those rivers. It's because of the mouths of the rivers. They knew that that was important to them because of their fishing economy and their fishing nutrition. And they said to the English, you can have the land north of here for farming or town development or whatever, but we must have this. And that's in the oral accounts at that time. I think this might be the last one. This is a general chart of the Great Lakes, the hydrographic. Again, science being used in order to strategically determine the wealth, the value, the expected return from these lakes. So for me, it was all about how can we generate wealth from this? How can we enrich our population, the king, the governors, all of those people? And so what they are doing here is very strategically mapping the depths of those waters and the breadth of the water, how navigable was it. They began, of course, building forts all around the lakes to protect them, both from the Americans but also from other invaders who could potentially be coming. So it's very military and it's very commercial. And what I was interested, of course, in is the magic. Because the lakes are magic, and the lakes are deeply embedded with story and beauty and care. They care for us. And so I beaded them and connected them and mapped them in that way. This is the last one. And this is a plan of the province of Upper Canada divided into counties. So these were the original lines that were drawn by the surveyors in order to begin to carve up this territory and turn it into something that looked like Europe, something that resembled the counties in the southern part of Great Britain. And for me, this was my response to that. It was to make something that was lyrical and dancing, something that was breathing and alive. When you look out at the lake, you can see it. You know, if you go down, and I know there's a river, we're talking about the river walkers, we have another river walker here. There are people who understand this. You know, that lake is a living being, and it has everything we need. And that's what I wanted to show with this drawing in a very simple way. So I go back to that circle of inquiry for the dish with one spoon. I had hoped that people from Six Nations, from the Haudenosaunee people, would come and talk with us there about these matters. So we have many matters to discuss. We have many, many stories to exchange. We have some griefs to settle. We have some things to say. But, you know, they didn't come. The people who came were the Mississauga people. And I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for that because I made it actually for you. At the end of the exhibition, the show came down at the end of December. This is the little glade I was telling you about on the first line. It's a little bit, it's quite close to the old cemetery. And I brought those grasses back, and I put them back where they came from to thank them for helping me to make this journey through all of these very complicated relationships and to try to find a kind of truth. I don't know if I actually did. Probably raised more questions than I had answers. But it was this little piece of land here that gave those reeds, and then received them back again at the end of December. So I say miigwech to that land and to those reeds and to those people who helped me. And that's my talk.